So they sent me home, and I think getting sent home from Bethel and then dealing with my life as a witness after that, that was sort of the beginning of the end, because I noticed that after I came back, and I was only there for 4 months, being sent back like that, I noticed that witnesses began to subtly treat me a lot different. You know, before I left, I was just the greatest thing, and now people were a little standoffish and a little cold. And I had a very difficult time dealing with the legalism within the organization. The depression stayed with me for a long time, and I was so burned out and so discouraged by just the trivial rules that witnesses have to abide by in order to be considered a spiritual person, getting in hours, so many of the standards that are really just man-made, and I didn't see a scriptural precedent for a lot of these standards, and I just became very, very, very discouraged, and I just wanted to give up. I made the decision to switch congregations. I went to sort of a stronger congregation, and that seemed to do the trick for a while. I was sort of reinvigorated. And another thing too that sort of kept me going was I started to drink a little bit heavily, and I noticed that sort of eased some of the emotional angst that I had, and it allowed me to suppress a lot of these feelings I had about the organization. It actually did a lot of good for a while in allowing me to keep going in the organization and to stay busy. For a while, I was able to really recommit to field service. I was really busy in the congregation, going out in field service a lot. But I noticed that my drinking started to get out of hand, and within a really short amount of time, I became an alcoholic. And this isn't something I normally share openly like this, but it's actually very relevant to my story and how I got out of the watchtower. So eventually I realized that it got out of hand, and I needed to get some help. So I checked myself into a program, and they recommended that I start going to some 12-step meetings. So I started attending some 12-step meetings. So now that I wasn't drinking, I no longer had any kind of mechanism to suppress all these doubts that I had been having. I no longer had anything to suppress these feelings and emotions I had towards the organization. I just had to deal with them. As I started going to these meetings, I started meeting, quote unquote, worldly people, and my conceptions about worldly people were totally false. I had always believed that pretty much all worldly people were a bunch of rotten, no good people, and as I began to make some friendships within these groups, these people were totally unlike the worldly people that I had been taught about in Watchtower publications. These were people truly trying to serve God and do the right thing and live their lives in the best way they could, and that started to create a lot of cognitive dissonance. I was hearing at the meetings that people who don't come into Jehovah's organization are worthy of destruction, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, but I was also meeting a lot more people who just didn't fit that description. And as part of my recovery from alcoholism, I had to start to really get honest with myself. One of the things I learned was that I couldn't lie to myself about anything anymore. I had to be completely honest with myself about all aspects of my life. And as I began to do a lot of journal writing, I began to have to address a lot of the thoughts and feelings I had about being one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and about a lot of the teachings that I had issue with. And I think it was Carol said that when you put things on the shelf long enough, eventually the shelf collapses, and that's what happened to me. Or the witnesses will say, just put that on the back burner, eventually you run out of back burners. That's what happened to me, and I couldn't ignore these things anymore. And I was going door to door, and my conscience bothered me so much that I was ignoring all these troubling aspects within the organization, but I was, wagging my finger at Catholics for just going along with the Vatican and not questioning anything about the Vatican. Mm-hmm. And I started to ask myself, what gives us the right to ridicule other religions when we just go along with whatever Brooklyn says and we don't question it? And so I started to really question my faith. I had to. So I began to just go to the public library. I began to study archaeology, and one thing I did was I told myself I'm not going to read any apostate literature. I don't want to have my mind tainted. I don't want anybody to influence me. I want to study this for myself. I want to really look over my faith with a fine-tooth comb and really prove to myself whether this is the truth or not. And what I did was I got my Bible, I got the inside on the scriptures, the All Scripture's Inspired book, and the book, The Bible, God's Word or Man. So I got those publications, and I just started from Genesis 1:1 and started reading and taking notes. And I didn't even get out of the book of Genesis before there were so many things that just jumped out at me that just weren't right. And one of them was that I began to see how the society tries to create analogies between these old covenant arrangements to the modern day Watchtower organization, analogies that just don't fit. And after doing a little bit of studying, I discovered a book at the library called Combating Cult Mind Control by Stephen Hassan. And I was curious about that because I had intuitively sensed that there were certain things in the organization that were kind of cult-like. I couldn't really articulate it, I couldn't put my finger on it, but I sensed there was something wrong there, the way that the society enforces this groupthink on people, and that there's no independent thinking allowed, and that people have to just go along with what comes to them through the Watchtower studies. This really began to bother me, and so I got that book, I took it home, and when I started reading this book, my jaw just dropped open because everything that he was writing about in this book was about other religions. Not once did he mention Jehovah's Witnesses, Watchtower organization, but I started seeing all these aspects that just fit the society to a T, and it reaffirmed a lot of things I had intuitively sensed about the organization. And so when I read that book, I knew that my days as a witness were numbered. I knew that I was going to leave the organization. I just didn't know when. But I can tell you that for me personally, having my entire faith, having my entire worldview just collapse like that, it was really traumatic. Some people have an easier time leaving the organization. They can leave, and a lot of their pain is from the shunning and leaving friendships. But mine was it was more emotional, psychological, of just dealing with my whole world just collapsing because everything that I had believed, I just didn't know what to believe anymore. I just knew that everything I had believed was a fallacy. So I tried to figure out, how do I leave the organization? And this created a lot of stress because my entire family were witnesses, and I knew that leaving for conscientious reasons immediately that would get me labeled an apostate. And this created just unbelievable stress. I decided to fade out of the organization. I just slowly stopped attending meetings. I didn't want to create any trouble. I didn't want to tell anybody what I was thinking and believing because I didn't want to get disfellowshipped. But I remember going to the Kingdom Hall on the last day. It was on a Sunday. I knew this was going to be my last meeting, and as I was mingling in the congregation, I couldn't let on that anything was wrong. I just had to pretend everything was normal, but I knew that this was going to be the last time I was going to be seeing a lot of these people, and it was a very difficult thing to do because I loved a lot of these friends, and I knew that I was going to lose these friendships. As I walked out of the Kingdom Hall that day, at the same time there was just this unbelievable feeling of freedom, like this weight had been lifted off my shoulders. And I walked away, and that's how I left. But that's when for me, the real emotional turmoil began, because I was so afraid of what this would do to my family emotionally, me being a quote-unquote apostate. I was especially afraid of what it would do to my mother, because my mother and I were very close, and she's the one who inculcated me with all of these teachings. And how was she going to handle this? And I didn't know if she could even handle it at all. And it was so difficult, and I actually seriously contemplated committing suicide instead of putting my family through it. I thought about, maybe if I just take my own life, they won't have to go through the pain of thinking I was an apostate. And I actually started planning it. And fortunately, through divine intervention, I regained some sanity and talked with some personal friends, and was helped, to see that that's just not a solution. And what really began to help me was posting online on an ex-witness discussion forum, because I finally had other people that I could reach out to and express my feelings openly. I could express the confusion, the anger, the fear with other people who had gone through the same thing, and they knew exactly what I was going through, and I could do it in a safe place where I didn't have to worry about people accusing me of being a wicked person. And that helped tremendously. And a major stepping stone to my recovery was discovering Cynthia Hampton's group. While I was doing research online and looking at some ex-witness sites, I found her group, and I attended the group. And the first time I attended, it was just this amazing experience. As I walked in and I met the Weissmans, George and Land, and met some other ex-witnesses, I just had this overwhelming sense of relief that it was going to be okay, because these people had gone through the same process. And it was unbelievable to me that there was other people who had the same exact observations about the organization that I'd had throughout the years, but kept it to themselves. And after our meetup group was done, we stayed out in the parking lot for about another 3 hours just talking. Lan remembers that. It was just unbelievable that there was someone else that had the same observations I had, and we just talked for hours about that. And I saw some light at the end of the tunnel. Meanwhile, I was kind of trying to hide this from my witness family, and that was very difficult. My mom discovered that I didn't support the organization anymore, and I had to tell her why. That there was just so many things that was wrong, and that began a lot of pressure from her. She kept trying to give me literature and telling me that I needed to come back, and telling me that I was misled by Satan. And sometimes I would question that. I would wonder, what if that really is the truth? What if I really did make this big mistake? And I had to rely on ex-witnesses. I would call Land a lot of times on his cell phone and say, I'm going through a lot of fear right now. I don't know if I made the right decision or not. And after a while, I would regain some clarity, and I would remember why I left. And I kept going forward. And probably the biggest thing that helped me to finally free myself from the indoctrination was discovering Ray Frann's book, In Search of Christian Freedom. Because when I read that, he went through all of the society's major doctrines, and he refuted them scripturally. And he provided just an enormous amount of documentation. And when I studied that, I knew, finally that I made the right decision to leave the organization. And I knew I wasn't going to be destroyed at Armageddon, that God doesn't work through an organization, and that I made the right decision, and that finally broke the indoctrination I had. So that finally broke all of the fear I had of attending a church. So I was invited by a friend